Hello. In today's lecture, I'll examine double DES and triple DES, which are two attempts at increasing the security of DES.
A natural question to ask is, how does one construct a more secure block cipher from DES without changing the internals of DES? This is a useful question because DES was widely implemented in hardware in the 1980s and 1990s, and so it would be useful to be able to reuse this hardware to construct a more secure block cipher. One approach is to use multiple encryption, wherein one would re-encrypt the ciphertext one or more times using independent secret keys. The hope is that this increases the effective key length of the underlying block cipher. I should note that multiple encryption does not necessarily result in increased security. Take, for example, the case of the simple substitution cipher. If epi denotes the encryption function for the simple substitution cipher with key pi, where pi is a permutation of the English alphabet, then one can ask whether epi1 composed with epi2, where pi1 and pi2 are independently chosen permutations, is any more secure than epi itself. And the answer is no. This is because epi1 composed with epi2 is the same as e with respect to the permutation pi1 composed with pi2. In other words, applying the simple substitution cipher with permutation pi1, followed by a second application of the cipher with permutation pi2, is the same as applying the simple substitution cipher once with permutation pi1 composed with pi2. Hence, double encryption in the case of the simple substitution cipher provides exactly the same security as a single application of the simple substitution cipher. Let's see whether multiple encryption can increase the security of DES. I'll first take a look at double DES. In double DES, the secret key K is a pair of single DES keys, each chosen uniformly at random from the single DES key space. In this course, by this notation, I'll mean that K is chosen uniformly and independently at random from the set K. Encryption in double DES works as follows. The plaintext message of length 64 bits is first encrypted using single DES and the first key K1. The resulting ciphertext is re-encrypted with single DES using the second key K2. The result is a double DES ciphertext. Double DES encryption is depicted by this equation. To decrypt the ciphertext with double DES, C is first decrypted using single DES and the second single DES key K2, and then decrypted again using the first single DES key K1 to give back the original plaintext M. Note that the double DES key length is 112 bits, and so exhaustive key search takes 2 to the power 112 steps, which is infeasible. Note also that the block length of double DES is the same as that of DES, namely 64 bits. Even though exhaustive key search on double DES is infeasible, there remains the possibility of there being a faster attack on double DES. And indeed there is one, the meet-in-the-middle attack. Here's the main idea of the attack. Recall that double DES encryption can be described by this equation, where E denotes the single DES encryption operation. By applying EK2 inverse to both sides of the equation gives us this equivalent equation. This equation states that if you encrypt M with single DES and key K1, you get the same block as if you were to decrypt C with single DES and key K2. Suppose now that K1, K2 is Alice and Bob's secret key for double DES. Suppose also that we are given 3 plaintext ciphertext pairs, M1C1, M2C2, and M3C3, that were generated by Alice or Bob using their secret key. In the meet-in-the-middle attack, we'll search for keys H1, H2, which also encrypt M1 to C1 M2 to C2 and M3 to C3. We'll do this by searching for all keys H1, H2 that encrypt M1 to C1, and for each such key H1, H2, we'll also check whether M2 encrypts to C2, and if it does, we'll also check if H1, H2 encrypts M3 to C3. If it does, then we're done, and we have found the key H1, H2, which encrypts M1 to C1, M2 to C2, and M3 to C3. And we'll conclude that H1, H2 equals K1, K2 with high probability. We'll search for all H1, H2 that encrypt M1 to C1 as follows. In step 1, we compute the left-hand side of the main equation for all guesses H2 for K2 and using C1 for C. So for all keys H2 in the single-des key space, we decrypt C1 using H2 and store the resulting block and H2 in a table sorted by first component. We'll then compute the right-hand side of the main equation for all guesses H1 for K1 and using M1 for M. And so for each key H1 in the single-des key space, we encrypt M1 using single-des and the key H1. We then search for the resulting block in the table. We'll say that the computed block matches a table entry if the computed block equals the first component in the table entry. For each such match, we have a key H1, H2, which encrypts M1 to C1. And so for this match, we'll check whether H1, H2 also encrypts M2 to C2. If it does, we'll check whether H1, H2 encrypts M3 to C3. And if it does, we'll output H1, H2 as our guess for the double-des secret key. I need to justify the correctness of the attack. I also need to analyze the running time of the attack. Let me justify correctness first. So I need to justify that if the attack finds a key H1, H2, which encrypts M1 to C1, M2 to C2, and M3 to C3, then with probability essentially 1, H1, H2 must be the secret key K1, K2. I'll do this by showing that there is essentially only one double-des key that encrypts M1 to C1, M2 to C2, and M3 to C3. And so, if we find such a key, then, with very high probability, it must be the secret key K1, K2. Here is the question whose answer we seek. Let E be a block cipher with keys of length l bits and plaintext and ciphertext blocks of length L bits. Let K prime be the secret key chosen by Alice and Bob. And let MICI be T known plaintext ciphertext pairs that were generated by Alice or Bob using their secret key K primed. These MIs are distinct. Note that CI is the encryption of MI with the key K primed for each I between 1 and T. The question then is how large should T be in order to ensure, with probability very close to 1, that there is only one key in the key space that encrypts MI to CI for each I between 1 and T. The answer is that we need to select T so that the expected number of so-called false keys is very close to 0. Let me explain how to determine the number of false keys. For each key in the key space, the encryption function, defined by K, is a permutation of the block space. This is because the encryption function EK is an invertible function. I'll make the heuristic assumption that for each key K in the key space, the encryption function EK is a random function. In other words, a randomly selected function. This assumption is certainly false, since in practice, an encryption function is not a random function. And also because a random function is almost certainly not a permutation, in other words, isn't invertible. Nonetheless, it turns out that this assumption is good enough for our analysis. This can be justified formally, but I won't do that here. Now, let's fix a key k in the key space, different from Alice and Bob's secret key k primed. Then, the probability that k encrypts each of the mi's to the given ci's for each I between 1 and t is given by this expression. The first probability, 1 over 2 to the L, is the probability that EK encrypts M1 to C1. This is because there are 2 to the L possible ciphertext blocks, and so the probability that EK encrypts M1 to the given C1 is 1 over 2 to the L. Similarly, this is a probability that EK encrypts M2 to C2, and this is a probability that EK encrypts MT to CT. Multiplying these probabilities together gives us the probability that EK encrypts MI to CI for each I between 1 and T. Thus, the expected number of false keys K is the probability that a single key is a false key times the number of possible false keys, which is the total number of keys 2 to the L minus 1. Minus 1 because we aren't considering K primed as a false key. And so the expected number of false keys is given by this expression. Let's return to the correctness of the meet-in-the-middle attack. I'll let E now denote the single des encryption function. Double des encryption is described by this equation. Double des has a key length of 112 bits and a block length of 64 bits. In the meet-in-the-middle attack on double des, we had 3 known plaintext-ciphertext pairs, and so T equals 3. By the formula on the previous slide, the expected number of false keys for double des with T equals 3 is roughly 1 over 2 to the 80, which is very close to 0. Thus, if a double des key H1H2 is found in the meet-in-the-middle attack that encrypts M1 to C1, M2 to C2, and M3 to C3, then with probability very close to 1, H1H2 must indeed be the secret key K1, K2. This justifies correctness of the meet-in-the-middle attack on double des. In other words, I've justified that the H1H2 that the algorithm outputs is indeed the secret key K1, K2 with very high probability. I'll now analyze the running time of the meet-in-the-middle attack on double des. In the analysis, I'll take one operation to be either a single des encryption operation or a single des decryption operation. The running time of step 1a is 2 to the power 56 operations because we do one single des decryption for each key H2 in the single des key space. Similarly, the total running time of step 2a is 2 to the power 56 operations, since we do one single des encryption operation for each key H1 in the single des key space. Step 2d is executed every time there is a match in step 2c. Now, the number of matches equals the number of keys H1, H2, which encrypt M1 to C1. That number is the number of double des false keys when T equals 1. By the false key formula, we see that this is roughly 2 to the power 48. And so the expected number of double des keys, which encrypt M1 to C1, is roughly 2 to the power 48. Hence, the attack will execute step 2d a total of 2 to the 48 times. So the total cost of step 2d is 2 times 2 to the 48, because each execution of step 2d does 2 des encryption operations. Finally, the attack will execute step 2e for each false key H1, H2 that encrypts M1 to C1 and M2 to C2. By the false key formula, the expected number of double des keys when T equals 2 is roughly 1 over 2 to the 16. And so we expect that step 2e is executed 1 over 2 to the 16 times for false keys and once for the actual secret key. Hence, the expected running time of step 2e is 2 times 1 plus 1 over 2 to the 16. So the total running time is roughly 2 to the power 57. Note that this is a lot less than the expected running time of exhaustive key search for double DES, which is roughly 2 to the power 112. Since 2 to the 57 is a feasible amount of computation, we might conclude that the meet-in-the-middle attack on double DES demonstrates that double DES offers essentially the same security as single DES. However, I've neglected the space requirements of the attack. Recall that in step 1a, we store a table of all DES keys H2 and the decryption of C1 using H2. Each table entry has length 56 plus 64 bits. There are 2 to the 56 table entries, one for each key H2. And so the total space of the table in step 1a is 2 to the power 56 times 64 plus 56 bits, which is roughly 1,000,000 terabytes. The 1,000,000 terabytes required for the attack is within the resources of large organizations like the NSA and Google. To put this in context, 1 kilobyte is 1,000 bytes, or roughly 2 to the 10 bytes. A megabyte is 1,000,000 bytes. A gigabyte is 1,000,000,000 bytes. A terabyte is 2 to the 40 bytes. A petabyte is 2 to the 50 bytes. And an exabyte is 2 to the 60 bytes. Today you can buy a laptop with 1 terabyte of disk storage. Even though the adversary might have 1,000,000 terabytes of disk storage at her disposal, accessing 1,000,000 terabytes of storage would slow down the attack. And so one might question whether the meet-in-the-middle attack on double DES is indeed cost-effective, and in particular, less costly than exhaustive key search on double DES. To address this concern, I'll mention that there is a very nice time-memory trade-off in the meet-in-the-middle attack on double DES. The attack can be modified to decrease the space requirements at the expense of increasing the running time. For any parameter s between 1 and 55, one can decrease the storage by a factor of 2 to the s, while increasing the running time by a factor of 2 to the s. For example, by taking s to be 10, one can decrease the storage requirements to only 1,000 terabytes, while increasing the running time to only 2 to the 66, which is still a feasible amount of work. In this way, we have both a feasible amount of storage and a feasible amount of operations. So we can now conclude that double DES is not much more secure than single DES. Double DES has not bought us any security for DES. In triple DES, the secret key K is a triple of single DES keys, each chosen uniformly and independently at random from the single DES key space. In triple DES encryption, a plaintext block of length 64 bits is encrypted 3 times in succession using single DES and the 3 independent single DES keys K1, K2, and K3. The ciphertext C is also 64 bits in length. Encryption is depicted by this equation. Decryption is done by applying the single DES decryption algorithm using the single DES keys K3, K2, and K1 in that order. The triple DES key length is 168 bits, which renders exhaustive key search infeasible. I'll let you verify as an exercise that a meet-in-the-middle attack on triple DES can find a secret key in 2 to the power 112 steps. This is much faster than exhaustive key search, which takes 2 to the 168 steps. Hence, the effective key length of triple DES against exhaustive key search is said to be 112 bits. While this is still infeasible, there is no proof known that triple DES is indeed more secure than single DES.
Triple DES is still deployed in practice, especially by some financial institutions, where its use can be expected to continue until the year 2030. We'll next take a detailed look at the Advanced Encryption Standard, the most widely used block cipher. AES is an example of a substitution permutation network. Have a wonderful day.